Now, one of the things I really miss during this pandemic is going on missions trips. For those of you who are new with us, before the pandemic, we used to regularly send out small teams of people for short durations to go and share the good news of Jesus Christ with people overseas. And every year, I would make it a point to join at least one or two of these trips because as the church grew bigger, it was no longer possible for me to know everybody in church personally, and I kind of missed that. And so going on these trips were very helpful because they allowed me to spend extended time with just a few individuals, a few church members, over a few days and getting to know them better. And that was really wonderful times. So on those trips, although I don't take breakfast normally, on those trips I will make it a point every morning to eat with somebody, make an appointment to eat with somebody and chat with them over breakfast. Now the funny thing was that on many occasions, during those times of breakfast, people whom I hardly knew would start talking to me about guess what? Their sex lives. Okay, it happens so many times, it cannot be a coincidence, you know? And it's so funny because they'll start telling me about the people that they were sleeping with, that they were not married to. And very often, these happen to be other people in the church. And then, I remember this guy was telling me about a serious problem in his marriage and his visits to the prostitutes, and how you're struggling with all those things. I tell you, most of the time when you go on a mission trip, the breakfast food is really boring, but the conversations were sizzling. We are not Roman Catholics, right? But not infrequently, the breakfast time became virtual confessioners. Now, if you're one of those people, relax. Your stories are safe with me. You're not going to become sermon illustrations today. My point really is that, sex occupies a lot more of our thoughts, and we care a lot more about it. It affects us a lot more than we dare or care to admit, right? And we want, actually deep down inside, we want to be able to talk freely and openly about this subject, but we feel awkward of doing so, and we are very fearful of being judged if we speak the truth. And I know this is especially true in church, right? Because in church, when you look around you, everybody pretend that they are asexual. They never have sexual thoughts and they don't engage in sex. Or that they are paragons of virtue. They never do anything wrong sexually, right? Or have any impure thoughts. And even if we talk to one another about sex, it is almost always in negative and prohibitive terms. No, don't do it. Okay? That's all. And that's why I've prepared this series called Sex Education, so that we can have a meaningful conversation with each other, not just me to you, but you with each other as well. So we go to cell groups. This next few weeks, please do talk to each other openly about this. Because contrary to what many people think, God is more interested than you or me in us having great sex, in us having safe sex, truly safe sex. And for today, I want to begin this series by explaining the biblical framework for thinking about sex. In the next few weeks, I will use that framework to show you why the rules and the boundaries laid down by the Bible on sex make good sense. So let's begin by reading the Bible passage found in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. I'm going to read all the way through to chapter 7, verse 7. Where the Apostle Paul wrote this, I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but, Paul says, I will not be mastered by anything. You say, food for the stomach and stomach for food, but God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said the two will become one flesh. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Flee from sexual immorality or other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against his own body. Do you not know that your bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit Who is in you whom you have received from God? You are not your own, you were bought at the price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And carries on to chapter 7 when it says, now, for the matters you wrote about, that it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourself to prayer. Then come together again so that the Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Paul addresses in this passage two widely held views of sex among his readers at Corinth. And both views flow out from the same Greek philosophy, which taught a certain kind of dualism. Greek philosophy taught that spirit is good, but physical, the body is bad. Spirit is good, body is inferior. And this led to two opposite views about sex. The first says that sex is just simply another physical appetite, just another biological activity. It's just like eating. That's why Paul says, quoted one of their favorite sayings, they say, food is for the stomach, and stomach is food, and God will destroy them both, meaning such things have no permanent significance. Don't get too uptight at that. There's no need to have all these rules to get so serious about these things. Just do it. Okay, if you need food, then go and find something to eat. And similarly, if you need sex, just find a willing partner. No big deal, right? Ironically, the same philosophy, that spirit is good, body is bad, the same philosophy led also to another extreme thinking, okay, and led to the opposite thinking, which says that sex is bad, sex is dirty. You should only engage in sex as a necessary evil, like for procreation, making babies. Otherwise, don't do it and don't even talk about it. That's why somebody wrote to the Apostle Paul to say, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And Paul addresses both these concepts, both views of sex. Interestingly, this was written nearly 2,000 years ago, but both views of sex remain just as fashionable today. That sex is either just a bodily appetite, just do it, or sex is dirty, don't do it, don't talk about it. And, we all tend to one or the other. And I myself as well. And I realized, when my children were a bit younger, and sometimes they came to our bedroom door and it was locked, okay? And then they'll bang on the door very angry. And if we don't open the door, okay, my daughter would say to the brothers, they are doing the unmentionables again. But it's not just my children. One time, I had a friend who came back from her honeymoon, and then we had lunch, and she was talking to me, and suddenly she just started sharing with me about how she and her husband struggled to have sex on their honeymoon. I don't know why people always do this to me, But it was very interesting because somebody had kindly bought them a book on how to do it right, how to do sex right. The problem was that she was telling me, as they were trying to make love, the husband would keep stopping midway through the process and say, wait, let me see what the manual says about this next. I think the husband did this because, like what our brother Sing Ming said, he was an engineer. Right? The husband was an engineer, but I assure you it's not Brother Sing Ming. I'm sure he's a great lover. Okay? But he kept doing that. It just drove her crazy, not with passion, but with frustration. And it was really hilarious, thinking about it. But, I sat there listening to her with, a poker face because I felt so squeamish inside. I felt so awkward. Like I didn't want to engage in this conversation about this subject with her over lunch. And later, I thought about it, and I realized that I too had been conditioned to think that sex is something dirty, something to be hushed up. Don't talk about it. Now, in response to both views of sex, that either it is no big deal or that it is a dirty thing, Paul explained what the true purposes of sex is, which I'm going to share today in 3 points. Okay, so let's get started. First, God gave us sex so that we may experience complete oneness. God gave us sex so that we may experience complete oneness. Now, Corinth was a bustling port city and was well known for its promiscuity. Even today, the word Corinthianize means to engage in sexual immorality. Okay, and some Corinthian Christians continued to visit prostitutes even after their conversion, and Paul wrote this to object to that. But let's ask ourselves this question. What's wrong? What's wrong with visiting a prostitute, especially if you are not married? Okay, what's wrong with that? I mean, if you subscribe to the first view of sex, that it is just a bodily appetite to be satisfied, then, it's perfectly fine, isn't it? I mean, willing buyer, willing seller, nobody gets hurt. Go and visit the karaoke lounges, keep the economy going, especially in times like this. Right? Nothing wrong with that. Now, and his answer to that, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 15 to 7, Paul gives us a profound insight into the purpose of sex. When he said, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I then take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? He said, never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her in body? For it is said the two will become one flesh. Tell the person next to you, one flesh. Okay, because we're going to focus on this concept. But whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Now, the key to this passage we've read, obviously, is the word unite, because Paul mentions it again and again. Right? He's saying having sex with a prostitute was not merely a commercial transaction like paying to have your hair cut or your teeth polished. And to explain why this is so, Paul went all the way back to page 1 of the Bible, and the first few pages of the Bible, which tells us that God's intention for sex is for two persons to become one flesh. Two persons to become one flesh. Now, what is the meaning of this one flesh? The answer is found in the beautifully romantic story in Genesis chapter 2, when God deliberately formed Eve by taking a rib out of Adam's side. And then he formed Eve with that. And when Adam wakes up and claps eyes on Eve for the first time, boy, he broke spontaneously into poetry. This is now bone on my bones and flesh on my flesh, for she was taken out of man, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. And then the writer immediately follows that up with the commentary that says, this is why a man will leave his father and his mother and be united with his wife, and two shall become one flesh. Tell the person next to you, one flesh. See, when you read this story as a whole, you realize that the idea of one flesh is not just about the fact that when a man and woman have sex, their body parts fit perfectly together, which obviously they do. More than that, in that very act, they become perfectly united. Or you can say reunited as one, for out of one, they became two. Right? And in the sexual act, they join back together as one. It is not merely symbolic of physical either. That union is mental, emotional, psychological, spiritual. It is a life uniting act. And that's why Paul urges them argues in verse 15 that the members of the church ought not to be joined with a prostitute. And in verse 17 he says, he who is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Paul's point is that the sexual union is never a merely physical one. God created sex such that it causes two persons, entire beings, to be bonded and meshed in such a way that nothing else ever could. And some of us know this from experience. Some of us know this instinctively because you were, or you even now are in a relationship and you had sex. And you notice, once you have sex, it just changes everything and it complicates everything, right? It makes it much harder to walk away from a relationship that you know is not going to work, it's bad for you, that you shouldn't be in. It's going to take you much longer to break up. And, even if the other person decides to walk out on you, you cannot help feeling cheated, devastated, depressed, though he or she never made any permanent commitment to be with you. And yet you feel something inside, right, that's not right. Okay, you feel cheated, you feel devastated. And for many people, the truth is this. Our deepest pains, our greatest regrets have to do with sex, even after many years have passed. Okay, that's why the Apostle Paul says that, no, when you sin sexually, you sin against your own body, which is kind of funny if you think about it, because there are other things that we do to our body that is also sinful, right? Self-mutilation, not taking good care of your health, or even suicide. These are all sins against the body. So why does he say that all other sins are outside your body? Only sexual sin has to do with the body. He's saying that nothing is like sexual sin, because sex bonds people to each other in a way that nothing else can ever do. Notice that we never feel this way about food. Come on, guys, can you even remember what you ate 10 days ago? No, right? Unless you are weird, no, you won't be able to remember that. You see, fulfilling your sexual needs is clearly not just like eating or drinking. There is no such thing as casual sex. Sex joins people together in a way that nothing else can do. We can use a condom as a physical barrier to try to keep out diseases or prevent conception, but I tell you, there is no condom that can stop the merging together of our hearts and souls in the sexual act. Why? Why do we feel this way about sex? Because that's how God designed it. God designed sex as a beautiful and powerful means to bring two people together in complete oneness. The purpose of sex, let me say, is not procreation. And the purpose of sex is not procreation. Making babies is a wonderful blessing that confers on us, that God confers on us through the sexual acts, but that is really not the purpose of sex. Notice the Bible never says of animals that they become one flesh. Never. Okay, even though animals obviously copulate and procreate just like us, but only human beings are ever said to become one flesh, and the Bible says this quite a number of times. Okay, because only human beings are given the special gift of experiencing whole person union through sex. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that just because two people have sex with each other, they become harmonious with each other and that everything becomes perfect in their relationship with each other. No, we know that this is simply not true. In fact, a lot of times once you have sex, everything becomes worse. Instead, what I mean is that sex brings two people together closer than anything else can. The intimacy experience in the physical and emotional joining of sex is simply unmatched in human experience. And the enjoyment of such whole life intimacy is fully intended by God because He's a father who loves to give good things to His children. Okay, that's why Paul objects to the Corinthians visiting prostitutes, not because sex is bad, but because it is good. So good, too good to be cheapened and used for the sake of obtaining a quick impersonal release, whether it is with a prostitute or having a one-night stand. The issue is not the character of the person you're sleeping with, but the nature of what you are doing. The wrongness is in engaging in a life-uniting act without life-uniting intention of having or joining together in communion without commitment. God intends that in sex we say to each other, I want to be joined to you, mind, body, and spirit. I want to commune with you with my entire being, you with me and I with you. Because God's purpose for sex is complete oneness. Secondly, God's purpose for sex is radical giving, radical giving. Because after addressing the popular misconception that sex is nothing more than just a bodily appetite function with no deeper significance, Paul then moves on to address the opposite error. The idea that sex is a bad or dirty thing that is best avoided, and just like Voldemort, okay, that which must not be spoken of. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 to 5, where Paul said the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to the husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband in the same way. The husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Okay, we must not read this with our cultural lenses on. Okay, but put yourself in the time when this was written. Like all ancient cultures, the Greco-Romans practiced double standards, terrible double standards, when it came to sex. Women can have sex strictly only with their own husband. But it's acceptable, it's fine. In fact, it's kind of cool for men to sleep around. If a woman has multiple partners, she's a slut. If a man has multiple partners, he's a stud. You know, a lot of those attitudes continue to do this day. Isn't it true? Right? Wives have a sexual obligation to their husbands in their time, but husbands have no sexual obligation to their wives. And that's why, imagine how staggering what Paul wrote is. He turns society's values on its head. He explains that both wives and husbands have a marital duty to each other. Their bodies don't belong exclusively to themselves anymore. Instead, their bodies are to be used in mutual ministry to each other. And saying something so profound, so countercultural, Paul is essentially teaching a more general Christian principle, which is this: the purpose of sex is not getting the most you can out of it, but giving the most you can into it. Our culture aggressively promotes sex as primarily for meeting my needs. Right? It's all about my fulfillment, my pleasure. And this gives rise to all kinds of problems. If you think about all the problems we have with sex, really that is the root of it. It is the root of sex offenses like rape, molest, voyeurism. Okay, so prevalent, and it is why pornography and prostitution are so prevalent. It is why people are so manipulative or exploitative in sex. Men pressure their partners to have sex. Women use sex to control men. Marriage does not solve the problem. Some people constantly demand sex from their spouses, and others selfishly deprive their spouses of sex. All these are driven by the same outlook that sex is primarily about me meeting my need, getting what I want. And Christianity provides us with a totally opposite view of sex, that sex is primarily about giving. Sex really works as God intended only when both parties use it for not for self-gratification or self-expression, but for self-donation. For radical self-donation. Sex is giving yourself with abandonment for the pleasure, joy, and well-being of the other person. I confess that for the longest time, I too thought of sex primarily as getting rather than giving. Or at the very most about mutual getting. I would want my wife to be happy in sex, but unless it also satisfies me, I'm going to be very unhappy. You see, nothing makes our selfishness more obvious as in sex. I can't say that I've been totally delivered from such a self-centered attitude, but this understanding of God's purpose for sex, that it is about radical self-donation, has been tremendously helpful to get me to move in the right direction. And let me just ask you this, whether it is sex or not, just think about this. Wouldn't this be how you want the person sleeping with you to think about sex and to do it? Wouldn't it be wonderful if he or she engages in sex with you as radical self-donation? Isn't that what you want? Of course. But this is how it works, right? If two persons, engage in sex, and both are only focused in getting the most out of what they can from the other person, obviously it's going to cause all kinds of problems because they will only be using each other. Neither is it going to work when you have one person doing all the giving and the other person doing all the getting. But if you have two individuals who both concentrate on giving rather than receiving, then they will both enjoy great sex. That's why there's no higher or more beautiful perspective of sex than the Christian view. Christianity does not see sex as dirty. Instead, it sees sex as the most glorious gift we can offer to the person we love more than anybody else. A presence that is more valuable than what money can buy and more eloquent than what words can say. A gift that is so precious, you will not just give it to anyone, any old how. And once you've given it, you wouldn't want to give it to anybody else either because that's what keeps it special and precious. Such a countercultural approach to sex makes sense only when you see in the larger context of what Paul teaches about marriage. In Ephesians 5, he commanded husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. You know, in a culture like what I said, where men treated women with little regard and women had very few rights. Again, this is very radical. Paul insisted and commanded men to lay down their life for their wives. In other words, to put their wife first in everything. When such a self-sacrificing outlook exists, then sex becomes the cherry on the cake. It becomes a powerful expression and enhancement of our love for each other. The brilliance and the beauty of sex is not found in what we can get from the other person, but what we can give to the other person. God's purpose for sex is radical giving. Finally, point number 3. Sex is meant to give us a transcendent foretaste. A transcendent foretaste. Christianity not only has a high view of sex, it has a beautifully balanced view of sex as well. What do I mean? Well, we can see that if you have too low a view of sex, like the Corinthians did, it would lead to all kinds of problems. On the other hand, if you have too high a view of sex, it would also cause another set of problems. That's why I love how the Apostle Paul struck a fine balance on this. How did he do this? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6 to 7, this is what he says. He said, I say this as a concession to husbands and wives, not as a command. I wish that all of you were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. What is he talking about? You see, Paul has just dealt with the error that flows from having too low a view of sex. Now, he wisely warns us against having too high, too exalted a view of sex. And to illustrate this, he points to himself as an example. I wish all of you were as I am. What's he saying? He is talking about his own status as an unmarried person. And then he will go on to write about singleness and celibacy as a perfectly legitimate option for living a fruitful and godly and satisfying life. Okay, I shall deal with that in the next few weeks. What Paul is saying is that sex is wonderful, but it is not crucial. It is desirable, but it is not indispensable. And that's a much needed balance, even today, especially today. If we buy into the lie that sex is the greatest thing in the world, the be-all and end-all pleasure, the die must-have experience for human flourishing and for identity, then you are setting yourself up for disillusionment and all kinds of problems. And yet, isn't that exactly how our culture promotes sex? In 1,000 different ways, subtle and not so subtle, our culture aggressively pumps out non-stop the message that you are not complete unless you are having a great sex life. If you're not engaging regularly in shaking sex, you are sadly not fulfilling your potential as a human being. Those of you who are old enough will remember a movie entitled 40-Year-Old Virgin, 14-year-old virgin. And the implied sarcasm in the title says it all, right? If you've never had sex by a certain age, man, you are pathetic. You of all people most to be pitied because you're missing out on the greatest thing in life. Everybody else has done it except you. There must be something wrong with you if you cannot persuade anybody to jump into bed with you. That's our culture's message. But overvaluing sex is terribly damaging as well. And it's why teenagers are so crazy about sex, not just because of raging hormones, but because they've been conditioned by our culture to think of it as a definition of worth and identity. You are not cool unless you are sexually attractive and active. And people, they get addicted to pornography. Okay, it's not just because they are lustful. It's because they look to it as a solution to fill the void that they struggle with in their lives, that they know is there, the hole in their lives. And you can escape anytime into a make-believe world where you don't have to perform, you don't have to relate, you don't measure up in order to enjoy sexual gratification from the most incredibly attractive women. Or people hook up with one another because sex is held out to be the ultimate way to find fulfillment and intimacy. Actually, in all of this, what are we really looking for? What do we really long for? The surprising answer is we are looking for something that is out of this world, something beyond ourselves. Something transcendent, in other words. And I think sex kind of gives us a glimpse of that transcendence, right? Yet in this life, sex does not live up to its promise. Even in the best of times, when everything comes together just right and all the stars align and you're mind-blowing sex, the truth is that it does not truly and totally satisfy us, or does not satisfy us for long. We are always left wanting something more. This is not it. What we sense instinctively is consistently, entirely consistent with the teaching of the Bible that we should view sex, value sex greatly, but not overvalue it. God did not create sex to provide ultimate fulfillment. Rather, he uses the joys, the pleasure, the goodness of sex to point to something even better, something that does provide ultimate fulfillment. What is that? Paul tells us the answer in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 31, 32, when he says, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. What is this? This is not sex. When Paul says this is a profound mystery, he's not talking about sex. He's talking about Christ and the church. In other words, he's saying both marriage and the pleasure of sex points us to something even more profound, something even better. It points us to the pleasure that we, the church, the people of God, will eventually one day experience when Christ returns to take us as his lovely bride. On that wedding day, the greatest day of our life, the biggest day of life, we would fall into his arms. And the joy we experience would be ultimate. That is the real satisfaction that we desperately pursue, but will never find all the days of our earthly life. That is the transcendence. That is the out of this world experience that nothing in this world, not even the best sex, can provide. You see, guys, ultimately, romance, marriage, sex, all these are merely a foretaste of the unbridled joy we were made for and that we will get to experience only in our eternal union with Christ. These things are like what I've said before, going to the ice cream parlor and asking to test the ice cream, and they give you a lick of the ice cream, right? You get a lick of the real thing at the ice cream parlor. They are not the real thing, just a foretaste of it. To have the real thing, what do you need to do? You need to buy the ice cream, right? You need to pay for it. Problem is, we will never be able to afford the real joys of heaven. Good news is that Jesus Christ came the first time 2,000 years ago to pay it. He has already paid it on our behalf so that we don't just get to have a lick, we get to have the real thing. So let me conclude. Notice I've said nothing at all about the Christian rules, and the Christian prohibitions, and Christian boundaries on sex today. I will deal with them over the next few weeks. But first, today, we need, for a start, to understand that God's primary message about sex is a big yes, not a big no. Tell the person next to you, yes. Okay, you're very awkward, talk about sex. Okay, obviously belong to the second school. Okay, yes. Unless you first grasp God's beautiful purpose for sex, all those rules, okay, will make no sense to you. You either respond in ridicule or in rebellion. Now, there will be lots of practical applications for the next few weeks. But for today, let me conclude with 2 points. First, those of you who are believers, thoroughly familiarize yourself with God's purpose for sex. Because unfortunately, the church as a whole has done a really bad job with this one, right? And caused more confusion and more problems than provide light and hope and guidance. Okay, so thoroughly familiarize yourself with God's purpose for sex. That God gave it to us so that two people made in His image can experience in sex complete oneness, practice radical giving, and enjoy a transcendent foretaste. Learn that. Meditate on it. Use it to correct the wrong ideas that you have. Internalize it. Rejoice over it. Thank God for it. And talk to one another openly about it this Friday. Because true sex education is not about the how, but about the why. Finally, for those of you who are not yet believers of Jesus Christ, consider this idea I've mentioned that you have probably never heard about. Contrary to the popular myth that God is against sex, it is in fact His way of pointing you to Himself. The goodness of sex points us to the ultimate goodness that God has in store for us, which is Himself. And if there can be such incredible pleasure and intimacy in sex in this life, imagine what it must be like to be finally united with Jesus Christ when He returns and takes us as His own. It is only in Christ that we will be ultimately and totally satisfied. God now invites you today. He invites you into relationship with Him so that you can one day experience the satisfaction that you are trying so hard to find and which you will never find in this life. He invites you into a relationship that one day you can experience that, and even now in this life you can get a foretaste of that. But only if you would stop trying to find it through your own efforts. And instead, confess that you are an unworthy sinner who needs God's forgiveness and throw yourself at His mercy. Then, on the basis of what Christ has done at the cross, you will be forgiven and accepted by God and have the assurance that for all of eternity, you will experience something so glorious that even the most intimate relationship and the best sexual pleasure is a pale shadow in comparison.